In 1943, in a factory lost between ruins and air raid sirens, a single bolt tightened. The wrong way made a tank engine faster than anything that war had ever seen. The official report called it a technological breakthrough. The generals called it a miracle. But the man who committed that mistake spent the rest of his life trying to decide whether it made him a hero or an accomplice. Today, you'll discover the hidden story behind that engine, the common worker ignored by engineers, the decision of a few millimeters that changed the speed of a war machine, and the weight he carried after those tanks started arriving at the front. This isn't just about metal and numbers. It's about conscience. Stay with me until the end, because perhaps you'll never see the word mistake the same way again. His name doesn't appear in any medal registry. You won't find his photograph hanging in museums dedicated to engineering innovation. Karl Weber, let's call him that, because his real identity was buried in factory records that burned during the final bombings, was just another body among 8,000 workers at one of the largest tank assembly plants in occupied territory. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., he clocked in under the shadow of camouflage nets stretched across factory roofs. The air inside tasted like machine oil and coal smoke. 12-hour shifts, sometimes stretching to 16 when production quotas lagged behind military demands. The factory floor was a mechanical orchestra of screeching metal, hydraulic hisses, and shouted commands that echoed off concrete walls stained with soot. Karl worked the engine assembly line, his station, torque calibration for the main drive shaft mounting system. Repetitive work, precise work, dangerous work if you let exhaustion cloud your judgment. Around him, French prisoners of war hauled component crates. Italian laborers operated welding torches with trembling hands. Greek forced workers assembled track links under the watch of armed guards who paced the catwalks above, rifles slung across their shoulders. Before the war, Karl had been an automotive mechanic in a small Bavarian town. Self-taught mostly. His father couldn't afford technical school. But Karl had a gift. He could listen to an engine and diagnose problems that left certified engineers scratching their heads. He could feel when torque specifications were wrong, when metal fatigue was building in components that looked fine on paper. That gift meant nothing here. Engineers in pressed uniforms issued specifications. Workers executed them. No questions, no suggestions. The hierarchy was absolute. Karl had a wife, Anna, and 2 daughters, 7 and 4 years old. Anna worked in a textile factory producing uniforms. They lived in a cramped apartment that shook every time Allied bombers passed overhead. Food rations were tight. Fear was tighter. Every night, Karl lay awake wondering if his factory would be the next target, if his family would survive another winter, if there was any difference between surviving and being complicit. The production quota for March 1943 was brutal. 75 Panzer IV medium tanks. The factory had never hit that number. Speer's armaments ministry was demanding miracles. The Eastern Front was devouring tanks faster than factories could produce them. That's when the pressure became unbearable. 72-hour work weeks became standard. Some workers, desperate to prove their loyalty, or simply too terrified to refuse, volunteered for back-to-back 24-hour shifts. The regime rewarded them with extra food rations, vitamin supplements, even promises of family vacations at confiscated resort properties. Karl wasn't one of them. He worked his shifts, kept his head down, and tried not to think about where these machines were going. On March 17th, during the 3rd shift under flickering overhead lights, everything changed. Karl was mounting an engine block to the transmission assembly. The standard specification called for a particular torque sequence on the main drive coupling bolts. Tighten in a star pattern, specific foot-pound measurements, using bolts with a particular thread pitch and metallurgical composition. But the bolts delivered to his station that night were wrong. Slightly different threading, different alloy composition. He could tell by the weight and surface finish. Supply chain chaos, probably. Components sourced from subcontractors across occupied Europe, quality control falling apart under bombing raids, and material shortages. Following the standard specification with these bolts would create a weak point. Karl knew it instantly. The coupling would hold under normal operation, but fail under sustained high-stress conditions. exactly the kind of abuse tank engines endured in combat. He had 3 options: halt the line, report the discrepancy, and wait hours for replacement parts while the quota slipped further out of reach. Install the bolts according to specification and knowingly create a flawed assembly, or make an adjustment. Carl looked at the clock. 2:47 a.m. His supervisor was across the factory floor dealing with a welding malfunction. Guards were focused on a disturbance near the forced labor barracks. Someone had tried to escape. His hands moved almost automatically. He recalculated the torque sequence in his head, compensating for the different thread pitch and alloy strength. He adjusted the mounting angle by 3 degrees, barely perceptible, but it redistributed stress loads across the coupling assembly. He tightened the bolts in a modified sequence, trusting his mechanical intuition over engineering specifications that didn't account for these specific components. The assembly slid down the line. The next station began installing cooling systems. No alarms, no inspections. The modification was invisible unless someone specifically looked for it. Carl clocked out at 6:00 a.m., walked home through streets scarred by bomb craters, and collapsed into bed without telling Anna what he'd done. His mind replayed the decision endlessly. Had he just sabotaged a tank that would break down in the field? Had he just improved it? Did it matter either way when the machine was built to kill? He had no answers, only the sick feeling that he'd crossed some invisible line. 3 weeks later, Carl was summoned to the quality control office. His heart hammered against his ribs as he climbed the metal stairs to the windowed room overlooking the factory floor. This was where disciplinary actions were decided, where workers accused of sabotage were handed over to the Gestapo. Inside, he found his shift supervisor, 2 senior engineers in Wehrmacht uniforms, and a testing technician holding a sheaf of performance reports. "Engine assembly E743, the senior engineer said, not looking up. "Your station." Carl's mouth went dry. "Yes, sir." "We ran standard stress tests on the last production batch before shipping to the training depot. One unit displayed anomalous performance characteristics. This was it. Sabotage charges, labor camp, or worse." The engineer finally looked up. His expression was unreadable. The engine achieved 17% higher sustained output under load than specification predicted. Cooling efficiency improved by 12%. Stress fracture indicators in the drive coupling assembly were significantly reduced. Silence. Carl's mind struggled to process the words. At first we assumed instrumentation error. We retested. Results held. The engineer set down the report. "Upon disassembly, we discovered modifications to the main drive coupling assembly, non-specification mounting angle, alternative torque sequencing, unauthorized deviation from approved engineering protocols." The supervisor stepped forward. "Did you make these modifications?" Lying would be pointless. The assembly bore his station stamp. "Yes, sir, the bolts were wrong, different specifications than the protocol required. Following standard procedure would have created a failure point. I compensated." The engineers exchanged glances. One of them made a note. "You determined this how? Are you an engineer?" "No, sir, mechanic. Before the war, I could tell by the weight and threading of the components." More silence. "Then, we're implementing your modification as the new standard specification across all production lines immediately. Effective tomorrow, all main drive coupling assemblies will use your mounting protocol. We estimate this will improve field reliability by 20 to 25% and increase operational speed by up to 3 kilometers per hour under sustained deployment conditions." Carl felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Sir, You'll sign documents confirming these modifications were made under direct engineering supervision, following verbal instructions from qualified personnel. Official reports will credit the improvement to our design optimization team. There will be no mention of unauthorized deviations or worker initiative. Is this understood?" It wasn't a question. It was an order. Carl signed the papers with a hand that didn't feel like his own. As he left the office, the supervisor caught his arm. "You got lucky, Weber, very lucky. Next time you get creative, we skip the conversation and go straight to the security office. Understood?" Carl nodded and returned to his station. Around him, the factory roared on, indifferent to the moment that had just shattered his internal world. Over the following weeks, Carl watched as his modification was reverse-engineered, documented, and systematically implemented across the entire production line. Engineers who'd never spoken to him before now studied his assembly techniques, took measurements, made calculations that formalized what Carl had done through pure mechanical intuition. The factory's output rate increased. Defect percentages dropped. A memo from the Armaments Ministry commended the plant's engineering team for their innovative design improvement. Several engineers received commendations. One was promoted. Carl's name appeared nowhere in the official records, but the tanks, those rolled out of the factory gates at an accelerated pace. Camouflage paint fresh, engines purring with improved efficiency, treads ready to chew through mud, snow, and the bodies of anyone who stood in their path. Carl began paying attention to news from the front lines. It wasn't difficult. The regime's propaganda machine constantly trumpeted victories, strategic advances, heroic stands. What they didn't broadcast, workers whispered: brutal conditions in Russia, entire divisions lost, cities reduced to rubble, casualties that couldn't be hidden despite the censorship. In April 1943, new reports began circulating among workers who had relatives in armored divisions. A new batch of Panzer IVs was performing exceptionally well in the field: faster cross-country speed, better sustained operation, reduced mechanical failures during extended operations. Carl knew which batch. He'd helped build every single one. One evening, a co-worker named Friedrich, whose son served in a tank battalion, pulled Carl aside during a shift break. Friedrich's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "My boy wrote. Says the new tanks are keeping them alive. Better speed means they can outmaneuver Russian T-34s. Better reliability means fewer breakdowns during retreats." He gripped Carl's shoulder. "You're building good machines, Weber. You're keeping our boys alive." Carl said nothing. Because what Friedrich didn't say, what couldn't be said out loud in a factory crawling with informants, was that those same tanks were also killing more efficiently. They were reaching villages faster, cutting off retreat routes more effectively, supporting operations that Carl couldn't bring himself to name. The dichotomy tore at him. Every improvement he'd made, every efficiency gained, served two purposes simultaneously: protect the crew inside, destroy the targets outside. At home, Anna noticed his deteriorating state. "You barely sleep anymore," she said one night, her voice careful. "The girls are asking why Papa always looks sad." How could he explain that his talent, the gift he'd always been proud of, had become a weapon? That his instinct to solve problems, to make things work better, had been conscripted just as thoroughly as if he'd been handed a rifle and sent to the front? "It's just the work," he told her. "The hours, the pressure." She didn't believe him, but she didn't push. In 1943 Germany, survival meant not asking questions you didn't want answered. By June, Carl's modification had been implemented across multiple factories in the Reich's production network. A Wehrmacht technical bulletin circulated praising the improved Panzer IV performance specifications. Tank commanders submitted field reports noting the advantages in combat situations. Carl received no recognition, but late one night, the factory director summoned him to the administrative building. Inside a wood-paneled office that smelled of tobacco and leather, the director poured 2 glasses of schnapps. "To engineering excellence," the director said, raising his glass. Carl stared at the amber liquid. "I'm not an engineer, sir." "No, but you think like one, better than most with degrees." The director drank, then studied Carl. "The ministry wants to increase your production quota again. We need every advantage to maintain output. Your insights have proven valuable. If you identify any other potential improvements, you report them immediately. Understood?" It wasn't an honor. It was a trap. They'd discovered his value, and now they'd squeeze every drop of innovation from him until there was nothing left. "Yes, sir," Carl said, because refusal wasn't an option. He drank the schnapps. It tasted like ash. Walking home through blacked-out streets, Carl passed propaganda posters celebrating German industrial might. "Every worker a soldier," one proclaimed. "Production is victory." He finally understood what they meant. He was a soldier. His weapon was a wrench. And every improvement he made, every problem he solved, killed just as surely as any bullet fired at the front. The question that haunted him wasn't whether he could have refused. The answer was obvious. Refusal meant death, for him and possibly his family. The question was, did understanding the impossibility of choice absolve him of responsibility for the consequences? He had no answer, and that uncertainty would follow him for the rest of his life. Summer 1943 brought two things to Karl Weber's factory: intensified Allied bombing raids and increasingly desperate production quotas. The factory was hit 3 times in July alone. The raids came at night, announced by sirens that sent workers scrambling to inadequate shelters. Karl would crouch in the darkness, listening to explosions that shook dust from concrete ceilings, and wonder if this was justice, if the bombs falling on factories were somehow more morally clean than the tanks rolling out of them. 37 workers died in the July raids. Production barely slowed. Bodies were cleared, damage was patched, and the lines resumed operation within hours. The regime's propaganda painted every bombing as an atrocity against innocent workers. Karl found the framing obscene. There was nothing innocent about a factory that produced 50 tanks a month. The Allied bomber crews knew exactly what they were targeting. What gnawed at Karl was the arithmetic of it. How many deaths did his improved engine design enable? If a faster tank reached a target 30 minutes sooner, how many lives did that 30 minutes cost? If improved reliability meant a tank remained operational for 1 additional week, how did you calculate the moral weight of that week? These questions had no answers, but they consumed him. In August, letters began arriving from the Eastern Front. Not official military correspondence. Those were carefully censored and revealed nothing. These were the letters soldiers smuggled out through informal networks, the ones that told true stories. Friedrich's son wrote about Kursk. The letter was brief, haunted. "The new tanks gave us speed, but the Russians had numbers. We broke through their first line in hours, then their second, then their third. But they kept coming. For every tank we knocked out, 3 more appeared. We drove deeper, faster than ever before, right into the trap. Half my battalion didn't come back." Friedrich aged 10 years reading that letter. He showed it to Karl during a night shift, his eyes hollow. "I told you the tanks were keeping them alive. I was wrong. They're just dying faster now." Karl had no comfort to offer, because Friedrich was right. The improved Panzerabwehren, with their enhanced engines and better reliability, had enabled deeper penetrations into Soviet territory. They'd reached objectives faster, created temporary advantages, but velocity and efficiency couldn't overcome strategic stupidity and overwhelming Soviet production capacity. All Karl's innovation had accomplished was accelerating the inevitable. His tanks didn't change outcomes. They just increased the body count on the path to those outcomes. September brought worse news. Anna's brother, who served in an infantry division, was killed during a Soviet counteroffensive. The official notification said he died heroically defending strategic positions. The truth, filtered through surviving members of his unit, was simpler. His division had been sacrificed to cover the retreat of tank battalions that had pushed too far, too fast, and couldn't be left behind. Anna collapsed when she learned. Karl held her while she wept and felt the weight of connection crush his chest. Had one of his tanks been in that battle? Had its speed enabled the advance that left his brother-in-law's unit exposed? He would never know. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. Karl began making mistakes at work. Nothing major. A torque sequence applied incorrectly, a gasket installed backwards. Supervisor reprimands, dock in pay, threats of reassignment. Part of him wondered if he was sabotaging unconsciously. if his hands were rejecting what his mind had accepted as inevitable. One night in October, he stayed late after his shift, alone in the assembly area except for guards patrolling the perimeter. He stood before the engine he'd just completed, perfect specifications, optimal performance, and considered what would happen if he deliberately introduced a fatal flaw. A subtle defect that wouldn't reveal itself until the tank was already deployed, already in combat. A failure that would strand it, neutralize it, remove it from the war. He stood there for 20 minutes, wrench in hand, staring at the engine block. In the end, he did nothing. Because sabotage would mean execution, and execution would mean Anna and the girls left alone in a collapsing regime with no protection, no resources, no future. So he completed the engine properly and walked away, hating himself for choosing survival. November brought a new horror. Rumors of atrocities being committed behind the front lines. Whispered stories of mass killings, industrial extermination, camps that weren't just for prisoners of war. Carl didn't know how much was true. The regime's propaganda claimed it was all Allied lies, but workers saw things. Transports of people who disappeared, factories retooled for purposes no one would discuss, orders for equipment whose function made no sense unless you allowed yourself to imagine the unimaginable. And Carl understood with sick certainty that the tanks he built weren't just weapons of conventional warfare. They were tools in a larger machinery of destruction that extended far beyond battlefields. One evening, he tried to discuss it with Anna. What if everything we're doing, all the work, the survival, the small choices, what if it's all in service of something unforgivable? She grabbed his arm, covered his mouth, looked toward the walls as if they had ears. In their apartment building, they might. Don't, she whispered. Don't think like that. Don't speak like that. We do what we must to protect our children. That's the only thought we can afford. She was right, but Carl couldn't stop thinking it. In December, the factory received a visit from high-ranking military officials. They toured the production lines, inspected engines, consulted with senior engineers. Carl watched from his station as they pointed at technical diagrams, discussed performance metrics, issued new directives. Later, Friedrich told him what he'd overheard. They're scaling up production again, want to implement your coupling modifications in tank models across the entire Wehrmacht armored divisions. Said it's one of the most significant performance improvements of the past year. Carl felt nothing. He'd moved beyond horror into a kind of numb acceptance. His invention, his accident, his improvisation, his talent would now be replicated thousands of times. The consequences would multiply beyond any possibility of calculation. That night, he wrote a letter he would never send. It had no addressee. It was written to no one and everyone. I tightened a bolt differently than I was supposed to. That's all. Just a small adjustment, a minor technical modification. But that adjustment is now inside machines that kill. It makes them faster, more reliable, more effective at their designed purpose. I did not create the war. I did not design the tanks. I did not give the orders that send them into battle. I am just a mechanic, following specifications, trying to survive. But my hands made something better. And better means more death. How much responsibility do I bear? At what point does the choice to survive become the choice to participate? I don't know. I will never know. And that uncertainty will haunt me until I die. He burned the letter immediately after writing it. Even private thoughts were dangerous in 1943 Germany. But the questions remained, unanswerable and unescapable. May 8, 1945. The factory stood silent for the first time in 4 years. Carl stood in the ruins. Half the facility destroyed by the final bombing raids, production lines torn apart, engines scattered across floors slick with oil and rain. American troops had occupied the town 2 days earlier. The war was over. He felt nothing resembling relief. The Soviet and American forces who liberated the factory found approximately 500 concentration camp prisoners who'd been used for forced labor in the final months. Carl had seen them, skeletal figures in striped uniforms, worked until they collapsed. He'd looked away, telling himself there was nothing he could do, that intervening meant death. Now those prisoners were being evacuated, treated, documented. And Carl understood that his silence had been another form of participation. In the immediate post-war chaos, Carl avoided scrutiny. He wasn't a party member. His applications had been rejected due to his working-class background and lack of political enthusiasm. He hadn't held any position of authority. He was just a factory worker, one of thousands. The Allied occupation forces were focused on identifying Nazi officials, dismantling military infrastructure, processing displaced persons. Individual workers at individual stations weren't priorities. Carl returned to small-scale automotive repair. He and Anna survived the immediate post-war period through black market trading, occasional mechanical work for occupation forces, and the slow rebuilding of civilian economy. They never spoke about the war years, not in detail, not about what they'd done, what they'd seen, what they'd chosen not to see. The girls grew up, asked questions sometimes. Carl gave vague answers about factory work, difficult times, things that were hard to explain. He never mentioned the bolt, never mentioned the engine, never mentioned the calculations he'd done in his head while tightening that coupling assembly in March 1943. For decades, Carl Weber was invisible. Again. As he'd been before the war, as he'd been during it. No records credited him. No historians knew his name. He was a footnote erased before it was written. He lived with that. Preferred it even. Recognition would have meant confronting questions he'd spent his life avoiding. But in 1989, something unexpected happened. The Berlin Wall fell. Archives opened. Researchers gained access to documents that had been sealed in Soviet-controlled territory for 45 years. Among those documents, complete production records from the Nibelungenwerk factory, including technical modification reports, worker station assignments, and engineering bulletins from 1943. A graduate student named Martin Kessler, researching his thesis on World War II armored vehicle production innovations, discovered a discrepancy. Engineering reports credited a major performance improvement to the factory's design optimization team. But buried in lower-level documentation, he found technical specifications stamped with a worker station number, E17. Cross-referencing personnel records, he identified the worker assigned to that station, Karl Weber. Kessler tracked Karl down in 1991. The old man was 74 years old, living in a modest apartment in Stuttgart, retired for over a decade. When Kessler knocked on his door, introduced himself, and explained his research, Karl's first response was, "I have nothing to say about that time." But Kessler was persistent. And perhaps Karl was tired of carrying the weight alone. Or perhaps he simply wanted someone to understand, even if they couldn't absolve. Over 6 months, Karl gave a series of interviews. Kessler recorded them, transcribed them, tried to understand the moral landscape Karl described. "It wasn't genius," Karl said in one session. "It wasn't planned innovation. It was just solving a problem with the materials I had. I made the coupling assembly work better, because I couldn't make it work according to specification. That's all. But better meant faster tanks. Faster tanks meant more people killed." Kessler asked, "Do you feel responsible?" Karl stared out the window for a long time. "I feel complicit. Not the same thing. The engineers who designed the tanks, they're responsible. The generals who deployed them, they're responsible. The regime that started the war, absolutely responsible. But me? I just tightened a bolt differently. Except that bolt killed people. So where does that put me?" "Huh?" No answer, just the question. Hanging. Kessler published his thesis in 1993. It won academic recognition, detailed the production innovations that had improved Panzer IV performance, and included a chapter on the unknown worker whose mechanical intuition contributed significantly to German armored vehicle capabilities in 1943-44. Karl refused all media interviews. When a German television documentary wanted to feature his story as an example of ordinary people's roles in extraordinary times, he declined. "I don't want medals," he told Kessler in their final conversation. "I don't want recognition. I spent my whole life trying to understand if what I did was wrong. I still don't know, and I don't think anyone else can answer that for me." Karl Weber died in 1997 at age 80. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his career as a mechanic, his service as a factory worker during the war, his decades of quiet life afterward. It said nothing about engines, innovations, or the weight he carried. But among his possessions, his daughter found a journal. Entries spanning 50 years. Most were mundane, daily observations, complaints about weather, notes about family. But one entry, repeated annually on March 17th, was always the same. "Today is the day I made something better. I still don't know if I should have." The story of Karl Weber is the story of countless individuals caught in the machinery of history. Not monsters, not heroes, just people trying to survive, making small decisions that cascaded into consequences they could never fully control or understand. The war remembered the tanks. It remembered the battles. It remembered generals and strategies and turning points. It didn't remember the man who tightened a bolt differently because the supplies were wrong, and the quota was impossible, and survival required solving problems without asking where the solutions would lead. Perhaps that's the most disturbing truth, that atrocity operates not just through evil intentions, but through ordinary competence applied in service of systems we don't control. That talent, innovation, and problem-solving, virtues in any other context, become instruments of destruction when conscripted by machines larger than individual conscience. Karl Weber died without definitive answers about his own guilt or innocence. And maybe that's exactly what history refuses us. Easy certainties about complicity and responsibility in circumstances where survival itself requires compromise. The question isn't whether Karl Weber was guilty. The question is, what would you have done with that bolt, in that factory, in that moment? And would you have spent the rest of your life wondering if you made the right choice?